Hi, I'm Pastor Colin Smith, and thanks for picking up this DVD series, Let That Idol Go. Now, when you hear the word idol, your first thought may be, hey, that's pretty far from my experience. I don't have any idols. Well, be prepared for a few surprises. Let me suggest 3 things that can easily become idols in our lives. Business. You start out trying to build a business, you get a job that places some demands on you, and before you know where you are, your work is taking over your life. It begins to define you. You begin to speak of yourself in terms of what you do, and it's become the very central thing. It's taking over. Here's another one, family. You have the joy of having a little child and then perhaps another one, and suddenly you find that family has become defining for you. It's who you are. You begin to forget that you ever were before you were a father or a mother. This has become life itself. And guess what? A third idol can be ministry itself. I know about this. Not only am I a father, but also a pastor. And I know how easily for a pastor, for anyone in ministry, serving the Lord can become more important than the Lord himself. That somehow what I'm doing in ministry can become defining for me, that it can begin to shape me, that it can be the thing that's placed at the very, very center of life. And you know what? That means it's becoming an idol. This series comes out of a book in the Old Testament, the story of Jonah. Most folks have heard about Jonah and the fish. I tell you, there's a whole lot more in this story, and it speaks very, very powerfully into your life as it does into mine. When I began to study the book of Jonah, I saw myself all over it. It's the story of a person who had been given the gift of ministry. He loved what he did, like I love my job, like you perhaps love yours as well. But over time, the work that he did for God became more important than the God he had set out to serve. And actually, he spent much of his life avoiding the God he had made a commitment to serve. He had become an idolater. Idols had taken their place in his life, and Jonah discovered that he needed God's grace in a whole new way. Well, we're going to follow his story. But before we get there, let's ask a few folks what they think of when we ask them about the word idol.
American Idol.
Something that you worship.
Someone you look up to, someone you idolize.
American Idol.
Well, I think if I were to pick a pseudonym, I would say paganism.
Someone that I look up to, someone that is upright, and someone that I can trust.
Statue or something that people will be, believing in.
Well, actually, I think of God's commandment that we should have no idols before him.
American Idol, yeah.
Someone you look up to.
Things that are not human.
Billy Idol.
Do I have idols in my life? I would say no.
All of my family members are my idols.
I don't believe any statues or idols because they don't exist.
It's more of nature and what surrounds me and the challenges that surround my body. So, I tend to look more internally than externally.
No, it's my mom and dad. I would idolize them, yeah.
It's kind of a hard question. I mean, besides her, but not really, no. I just mainly her, I think.
I'm idol.
When we moved, and I started to pack up my things to move cross country, I thought I have a lot here that I don't need to have. So I would suppose purchases.
My idols would probably have to be him and my brother.
Definitely my mother. I look up to her. She always tries to do the right thing. My sister, my boyfriend, and anyone in my church group.
You can call special people like my father, my mother, but they're not idols. They're just like me, like anybody else. The only idol, like you could say, is, like I say, Jesus Christ or God, which is, he doesn't call himself idol because he was a humble man.
Then I guess, it's self-idolism.
So many definitions of idols, so many ideas that come to our minds. I wonder what you would have said if you identified with one of these things that these folks said about idols. What I know for sure is that we are going to discover that idols come much closer to home than we may have thought before. I know that was my experience in taking the journey that we're going to take together through the story of Jonah. Now, here's what I hope you're going to discover and to get out of this journey that we're taking together. I want you to discover, perhaps in a new way, who God is. For you to see that He is more wonderful, more glorious, greater by far than anything or anyone who could ever possibly be put in His place. I want you to discover the greatness and the glory of God. I want you to find a new freedom in Jesus Christ. See, here's the problem with idols. Idols have power over our lives. When business or family or ministry becomes an idol, when it takes the place of God in your life, it's actually exercising power over you. It's controlling you. And you know that that is not where you want to be. Well, I'm not going to suggest for 1 minute that you give up your business or that you give up your family for sure, but that they find their proper place under the lordship of Jesus Christ, because that's where you're going to find freedom. And it's a very wonderful thing to discover. So I want you to discover who God is. I want you to discover a new freedom in Jesus Christ. And then as we go through this journey, for you to see where there might be idols that are hanging out in your life so that you can let them go. You know, here's Jonah's testimony to us and the great lesson of his whole life. He said this: those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs. An amazing statement. You cling to an idol, you actually lose out. You forfeit. You miss out on grace that could be yours from God. Well, we want to discover the grace, and that's why we're about letting that idol go. Now, I want to introduce you to a couple of friends of mine who know a great deal about business, family, and ministry. So come and meet John and Christina.
Christina, this topic of idols and idolatry, I found it very challenging. Even the words I found challenging. I don't know if it's been like that for you at all?
Well, idol, it kind of seems a bit antiquated.
Yeah,
I mean,
the words.
American Idol, I mean, that's maybe the closest pop culture.
Whenever I think of idol, for some reason I think of the folks in the desert burning gold and making calves, or I think of the ancient Greeks, right? And it's sort of allowed me to put it on this extreme end of the spectrum and think, hey, buddy, I'm not an idolater. I don't need to worry about that one. And then, you know, I think to myself, yet at the same time, the very sound of my BlackBerry receiving a new email has woken me up from my sleep, has taken me away from my kids, from my Bible, and it's a little bit scary, kind of convicting. I think this idol thing is actually something pretty relevant.
Absolutely. That's funny you say your BlackBerry sometimes gets you away from your Bible, because it's my kids that get me away from my Bible. Even if I try really hard to carve out that time, someone always seems to need something.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Do you have idols in your life? Your first thought is probably no, but let me suggest 3 possibilities. Business, family, ministry. Hi, I'm Colin Smith. I'm a husband, a father, and a pastor, and I know that ministry can become an idol. And with me is Christina Bradish. Christina worked in advancement in a university for some years. You're now giving your time to your work as a wife and as a mother. And you think, Christina, that raising young children can become an idol?
How can they not be an idol, Colin?
All-consuming. John Aiello is a husband, a father, and a business entrepreneur. And John, in 1999, you co-founded the Savo Group. It's become one of the fastest growing software companies in Chicago. And even the way that I've introduced you kind of defines you by your job.
It does. I mean, it's not unlike every introduction that happens to us from the age of 18 and on, men and women. You know, what do you do for a living? What's your career? What are you studying? And it does tend to define us. And that along with the all-consuming families that we're raising too. And these things get elevated in our lives for who we are.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the things that can become idols in life. What comes to your mind, Christina, when you think about that?
Well, when I think about family, it's hard not to think about the quality of relationships. I think that we want strong relationships. We want just good communication between people, whether it's immediate family, extended family. And that, I know for me, is an idol. I want to be able to
Are the relationships
that.
exactly like you thought they were supposed to be?
Right, my expectation of this is what I wanted them to be, but they're not this way.
There are no perfect families.
Same concept in the business world, right? You know, hey, listen, I've planned out my career. I'm going to achieve this level by this age, this salary by that age. My nest egg, of course, will be growing at this perfect pace all along the way. And the fact of the matter is, it's out of your control in so many cases.
Now, all three of us are married. We all have children, but it's not just married folks with children who have these issues. No. I mean, what about before we were married?
Right. Even as a single person, I feel like sometimes the allure of independence can become an idol. We want to be self-sufficient. We want to be on our own, doing our things on our time. And that so often can be a subtle idol.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, again, Colin, just in the business world, I had the great blessing of starting a company and running a company, but idols are not, simply precluded to folks running organizations. I think when you begin your career, when you're at the tail end of your career, the different pursuits you have and how prominent they are in your day-to-day thinking and how distracting they can be from other priorities that are more godly and more important.
Right.
Got to have that degree. Got to get married to that perfect person.
Absolutely.
Got to have these children. Got to have this advancement in career. Got to have this marvelous retirement.
It's our plan.
Grandchildren. It's all there. Jonah was a mega successful guy. His work was to speak the word of God, and he had a loyal and a faithful audience in his hometown of Gath Hepher. But one day God spoke to Jonah, "Go to Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me." Well, Jonah's whole world was thrown into crisis. He didn't want to go, and I don't blame him. Nineveh was a city of blood, full of plunder, never without victims. That's how it's described in the Bible. It's not exactly the kind of place that you would choose for a vacation. So God called Jonah to leave the place he loved and to serve in a violent and a hostile city. Well, how would you have felt? Jonah was a prophet. He had devoted his life to serving God, but over time, the work he was doing became more important than the God he was serving. Jonah's work became an idol. And when God interrupted his life and called him to something new, the idolatry of his heart was exposed. See, idolatry is basically taking something that God has given to you and putting it in the place of God himself. It could be your business. It could be your family. It could be your ministry. Someone said that the human heart is actually a factory of idols, always coming up with something new, always producing something to put in the place of God. Well, how would you know that something has become an idol in your life? Well, if you feel that your life would no longer be worth living without that thing or without that person, it's probably become an idol. And it's very easy for that to happen with your family, with your work, and with your ministry. That's what happened to Jonah. His work, his ministry, the people in his hometown of Gath Hepher, they became his idol. And when God called him to something new, he ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. When he got on the boat, he was really checking out. He was quitting. He turned away from God. But God wouldn't let him go. Years later, when Jonah looked back on all that had happened in his life, he said, "Those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs." See, if you cling to an idol, you lose, you miss, you forfeit the grace that God is ready to give you. And that's why we've called this series, Let That Idol Go. We want to help you think about the idols in your life and to let them go, so that you will be able to experience, receive the grace that God has for you in Jesus Christ. And we've called this program the Wake-Up Call, because that's what happened to Jonah. Maybe it's also happened to you. Things were moving along in your life, and then something happened and it changed everything. You faced a new challenge. You experienced a disappointment or maybe a terrible loss. These are holy moments in your life. It's God's wake-up call, and he's speaking to you. John, you ever experienced in your life a wake-up call?
Well, I think I've experienced many. I think over the past few years, I probably share this one in common with everybody in the business world, and it was this gigantic wake-up call called the economy. Yeah. Things going along smoothly, thinking, hey, you know what, we're doing this right, it's going according to plan, and then all of a sudden, out of the clear blue comes this fairly unexpected thing that's completely out of your control, and it shook a lot of the foundation that I had in terms of running a company and the people within it, and it was very challenging. I think wake-up calls probably being kind in terms of what I felt during that time, very much.
Out of control? Does that apply to the family?
Just slightly. There's so many different variables with raising children, and like I've mentioned before, so many different, very subtle, quiet idols that creep up. Anything from the way you parent. Maybe there's a certain way that you always like to approach your kids. That can become, a distraction that can get in the way of how you relate to God as well. I'm not willing to let go of how I discipline or parent or raise them.
How I expected it to be, right? I mean, this is how I expected it to be. This was my plan.
Yeah.
So you're not in control. I mean, I experienced that in ministry as well. That goes across life. Yeah. When you find you're not in control, what's the effect of that on your soul, John?
It's challenging because, at least in running a business, and trying to do it in a godly way, I felt like I was doing what God was calling me to do, and attracting people and leading them in ethical ways and serving customers. You feel like you're doing things right, and then all of a sudden the foundation just completely shakes, and the effect on your soul is, for me, is I just got to work harder. I got to work smarter. I got to hire more people. We got to just, buckle down, be the entrepreneur. And frankly, it's turns out to be fruitless in the end. It's not the plan. And I think it's a cleansing of the soul, but it's a painful cleansing. It's not an easy one.
Yeah.
And that's similar too in the family life. I think of extended family as well as your immediate family. It's just frustrating at times when you see, like you said, you're working and you feel like you're doing it diligently, you're doing it in a God-honoring way, and yet you yourself can still get in the way of that, and that can still really deter you.
It's a challenging thing about idols we were talking about earlier. You don't want to admit you have idols because it sounds so polarizing, and at the same time, it's the subtlety that you allude to, Christina, that's very powerful and really does wake you up from this slumber that you're in and this comfort zone that you're in.
Christina, there was a time in your life when you really rather like Jonah, kind of moved away from God. And
that story really resonates with me on many levels. When I was still a single person and just really frustrated with where life had taken me, and really finding myself shaking my fist at God, not getting into the graduate school or schools I wanted to get into, not really satisfied with my job, really disappointed with the relationships in my life, and selfishly said, I am done with this. Time out. I am out of here. Literally.
Boarding the next boat to Tarshish.
Yeah.
Frustrated, disappointed, not in control, the dream's not happening. Yeah. I wonder what your dream has been. Maybe it's the picture-perfect family, or the intimate marriage, the career in business, the achievement in sports, successful ministry, children who live close to you and visit each week, a long and comfortable retirement. There's nothing wrong with any of these dreams, but it is so easy for the dreams to become idols. And when we set up idols, you know what? God takes them down. And when God gives you a wake-up call, you may find that there's a thinly veiled selfishness at the center of your life. You didn't see it before, but now it's brought out into the open. You've been pouring yourself into your work, into your family, into your ministry, and then the unexpected things happens. A sports injury just puts you off the team. A merger from your company eliminates your position. A relationship that might have led to marriage for you ends. A loved one becomes sick or dies. The longed-for child is not conceived. You hadn't planned on this. It's out of control. It wasn't expected. But now your dream's shattered. And it seems like the whole of your life is thrown into confusion. Now, how are you going to respond? What are you going to do when God gives you this wake-up call? Well, there are two ways to go. One is the way of Jonah. He was called to leave the home that he loved, to go and serve in this violent city for the sake of people who were loved by God but were facing an imminent judgment. And Jonah said, no way. He hardened himself towards God, and it led from one disaster to another in his life. And that's why he said, those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs. The other way to go is the way of Jesus. Now try to imagine this with me. Jesus, the Son of God, was at the right hand of the Father in heaven. He too was called to leave the home he loved, to go into a dangerous and a violent city, and his calling would involve facing torture, crucifixion, and death for the sake of people loved by God who also were facing imminent judgment. That calling was indescribably difficult, but Jesus said yes. And the Bible says Jesus will see the fruit that comes from all the trouble of his soul, and he will be satisfied. Now, I'm really gripped by that contrast between Jonah and Jesus. And thinking about it, I've been praying this prayer: Lord, make me less like Jonah and more like Jesus. Save me from being the kind of person who cares more about my own comfort, my reputation, my success, my life plan than I do about people, the people you're calling me to serve. Help me to keep my dreams on your altar and be ready at all times to respond to you in faith and obedience. Now, I want to give you this promise. When God calls you to something new, he's always up to something good. That's true however difficult your calling or your situation may be. I want to challenge you then to place your dream on the altar of God today, to place yourself wholly and unconditionally into the hands of God who loves you. Now, that means saying to God something like this: here's what I wanted. Here's what I hoped for. Here's what I desired. We all have our plan. But I will not make that plan, that dream, an idol, because you are more to me than the gifts that you give. So right now, give me the grace to do your will. John?
Colin, thank you. This has been a very challenging discussion. I will have to say, coming out of it, that I do feel convicted that I too am an idolater. When I feel challenged, it's always helpful to me to have a few questions to ponder, to talk about, to think about, to pray about. So I'd like to offer you 3 questions. Number 1, has something happened in your life that you would consider a wake-up call from God? Number 2, and be honest with yourselves, what idols can you see in your life right now? And then number 3, what would it mean in your life to be less like Jonah and more like Jesus?
In preparing for this series, all 3 of us have seen how idols can sometimes quietly hide out in our lives. And I hope that we've helped you to identify some idols that might be lurking in your life. Now, the natural response to realizing there are idols in our lives is, well, I can deal with this. But that confidence can be a subtle idol. Only God can fix the idols in our lives. So we'll talk more about that next time on Let That Idol Go.
So join us next time, and remember, those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs. So don't miss the grace that could be yours in Jesus Christ today.